The morning sun climbed slowly above the Wyoming mountains, spilling warm golden light across miles of rolling grasslands. A gentle breeze drifted through the cottonwood trees surrounding the Turner Ranch, carrying the familiar scent of fresh hay and pine. It was the kind of peaceful morning that made a man believe the world had finally forgotten his name. For Jacob Turner, peace had become a way of life. At 38 years old, he had built his ranch with his own hands. Every fence post, every stable, every weathered board on the old farmhouse carried memories of years, filled with sweat and sacrifice. The people in nearby Red Creek respected him as a hardworking cowboy who spoke little, kept his promises, and never interfered in anyone else's affairs. Few knew anything about his past. Jacob preferred it that way. His father had disappeared 25 years earlier, without leaving a single letter or explanation. Some believed the old man had died somewhere on the frontier. Others whispered he had become an outlaw. Jacob stopped asking questions years ago. A man could spend his whole life chasing ghosts. Instead, he chose to build something real. His mornings always began the same way. Before sunrise, he fed the horses, checked the cattle, repaired broken fences, and watched the mountains slowly wake beneath the first rays of sunlight. That morning seemed no different, until someone knocked. 3 slow knocks echoed across the porch. Jacob frowned. Hardly anyone visited the ranch without sending word first. He wiped his hands on his work gloves and walked toward the front door. When he opened it, time seemed to stop. Standing on the porch was a young woman, perhaps 23 or 24 years old. She wore a cream-colored prairie dress beneath a dusty brown traveling coat. Her boots were worn from weeks of walking. A small leather suitcase rested beside her feet. Her long chestnut hair moved gently in the morning breeze. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Jacob's attention. It was her eyes. They looked exhausted, hopeful, afraid, almost as if she had spent months searching for someone she wasn't sure existed. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, the young woman broke the silence. "Are you Jacob Turner?" His voice remained cautious. "Who's asking?" She swallowed nervously. "My name is Clara." Jacob waited. Then came the sentence that froze the blood in his veins. "Your father sent me." The world seemed to fall completely silent. Even the birds stopped singing. Jacob stared at her, convinced he had heard wrong. "My father?" She nodded. "Yes." His expression hardened. "My father disappeared 25 years ago." "I know. He's dead." "I don't think he is." Jacob almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he stepped onto the porch. "Young lady." His voice remained calm. "I don't know who told you this story, but you've come to the wrong ranch." Clara slowly reached into her coat pocket. Jacob instinctively moved his hand toward the revolver resting on his belt. Instead of a weapon, she pulled out an old leather envelope. The leather had faded with age. Its corners were cracked. A wax seal had long since broken. She carefully handed it to him. Jacob looked down. His breathing stopped. Burned into the leather were the initials ... E.T. Edward Turner. His father's name. His hands suddenly felt cold. Slowly, almost fearfully, he opened the envelope. Inside rested a single folded piece of yellowed paper. His eyes widened immediately. He recognized the handwriting before reading a single word. He hadn't seen it in 25 years. But some things never leave your memory. His father's handwriting. His hands trembled as he unfolded the letter. It began simply, "Jacob." Nothing else mattered. For several long moments, he couldn't continue reading. The memories came rushing back. A younger Jacob running beside his father through open fields, learning to ride horses, repairing fences together, fishing in the river every spring. Then, the arguments, the shouting, the mysterious strangers visiting late at night, and finally, the morning his father vanished forever. Jacob had been 13 years old. His mother cried for weeks. Months later, she passed away from illness. Since then, Jacob had lived alone. He forced himself to continue reading. "If you're holding this letter, it means I have finally run out of time." Jacob's heart pounded. "Everything you were told about me was only half the truth." His eyes moved faster. "There are things I must explain ... Before he could continue, a loud gunshot echoed across the valley. Boom! Jacob instantly folded the letter. His ranch horse neighed violently inside the corral. The cattle began running. Another gunshot followed. then shouting. Jacob looked toward the distant hillside. 3 riders were racing across his land. Fast, too fast to be neighbors. One carried a rifle. Another pointed directly toward the ranch house. Clara's face turned white. They found me. Jacob looked at her. What did you say? I tried to lose them. The riders came closer. Dust rose behind their horses. Jacob counted quickly. 3. No. 4. 4 armed riders. His instincts immediately took over. He grabbed Clara's suitcase. Inside, she hesitated. Now, she hurried into the farmhouse. Jacob closed the door, locked it, then walked calmly toward the rifle hanging above the fireplace. Years on the frontier had taught him something important. Sometimes trouble finds you, whether you invite it or not. Outside, the riders reached the front gate. Their leader removed his hat. A scar stretched across his left cheek. Cold gray eyes studied the ranch. Then, he smiled, not kindly, the smile of a man who enjoyed frightening others. He called toward the house. We're looking for a young woman. Jacob stepped onto the porch with his rifle resting comfortably across one arm. You found a ranch. The scar-faced rider chuckled. Don't make this difficult. Jacob remained silent. The rider continued. She stole something. Jacob glanced briefly toward the closed front door, then back toward the strangers. What did she steal? The rider smiled again. Something that doesn't belong to her. Inside the house, Clara whispered through the window. Don't believe him. Jacob didn't answer. Instead, he asked another question. What exactly are you boys hoping to find on my property? The rider's smile slowly disappeared. A leather journal. Jacob's eyes narrowed. A journal? The man nodded. It belonged to Edward Turner. The name struck like lightning. His father's name. Again, Jacob slowly looked back toward the farmhouse, then toward the letter still resting inside his coat pocket. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. It was only beginning. And for the first time in 25 years, the mystery surrounding Edward Turner's disappearance had returned to his doorstep. The peaceful life Jacob had built was about to disappear, because somewhere inside that old leather journal ... was a secret powerful enough to make armed men kill for it. By sunrise, they would have to decide whether to run or follow Edward Turner's final trail into the mountains. And somewhere beyond those peaks, Victor Kane was already preparing for the hunt. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the Wyoming mountains as Jacob Turner saddled his horse in complete silence. The peaceful ranch no longer felt like home. Every gust of wind seemed to carry the warning Edward Turner had written decades earlier. If you're reading this, they finally found you too. Those words echoed through Jacob's mind as he secured the old leather journal inside his saddlebag. Across the yard, Clara emerged from the farmhouse, carrying only her small leather suitcase and a thick wool blanket. She looked exhausted but determined. Weeks of running had taught her never to carry more than she could protect. Jacob glanced toward the eastern hills. They'll be watching. Clara nodded. They always do. Before leaving, Jacob entered the barn one last time. Hanging on the wall was his father's old Winchester rifle. It had remained untouched for 25 years. He lifted it carefully. The worn wooden stock still carried the scratches from long cattle drives. His father had once told him, "A rifle is only as honorable as the man holding it." Jacob loaded fresh cartridges. Something told him he would need it. An hour later, the 2 riders left the ranch and followed the faded trail marked on Edward Turner's map. The route led north through dense pine forests where sunlight filtered through. Towering trees, snow still clung to the highest mountain peaks, while rivers cut through the valleys below. For several hours, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jacob broke the silence. "You said your grandfather knew my father." Clara looked ahead. They were best friends. Jacob frowned. "My father never mentioned him. He couldn't." "Why?" "My grandfather changed his name after the attack." Jacob slowed his horse. "What attack?" Clara took a deep breath. 25 years ago, 7 men escorted a government payroll through these mountains. Jacob remembered Victor Kane's story. The missing gold. She nodded. But there was never any missing gold. Jacob looked confused. "What do you mean?" "There were no gold bars. What was inside the wagon?" Clara's voice became almost a whisper. "Government records." Jacob stared at her. "Records? They contain the names of powerful businessmen, corrupt politicians, and military officers secretly selling land that belonged to frontier families. Jacob's eyes widened. So my father, discovered the truth. The realization hit him harder than expected. Edward Turner hadn't stolen treasure. He had protected evidence. Evidence someone had spent 25 years trying to erase. Suddenly, Jacob understood why people had died, why Clara had been hunted, why Victor Kane wanted the journal. It wasn't about wealth. It was about silence. Late that afternoon they reached a narrow canyon hidden between towering cliffs. According to the map, the red X lay somewhere beyond it. The canyon felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. Jacob immediately noticed broken branches beside the trail. Fresh horse tracks. He dismounted. We're not alone. Clara looked nervous. You think they're here? Jacob knelt beside the tracks. Less than 2 hours ahead, someone had reached the canyon before them. He quickly led the horses behind large boulders. Together they continued on foot. The canyon narrowed until only a single path remained. Then, Jacob stopped. A weathered wooden cross stood beside the trail. No name, no date, only 3 carved words. He chose truth. Jacob slowly brushed away years of dust. Beneath the cross lay another folded letter sealed inside an old tin box. Edward Turner's handwriting. Again, Jacob carefully opened it. Jacob, if you've reached this place, then I failed to keep my promise. His hands trembled. I wanted you to grow up far away from this burden. But evil rarely stays buried forever. Jacob continued reading. The records are hidden beneath Eagle Rock. Never let them fall into the wrong hands. Trust no one, except the woman carrying this journal. Jacob looked toward Clara. She quietly wiped tears from her face. He trusted my family. Jacob nodded slowly. He did. Suddenly, a rifle cracked through the canyon. Boom! The bullet shattered the wooden cross. Splinters exploded into the air. Down, Jacob shouted. Both dove behind massive rocks. More shots echoed from above. Victor Kane stood on the cliff overlooking the canyon. 8 armed riders surrounded him. I knew you'd follow the map, Victor yelled. Jacob cursed under his breath. They let us lead them. The canyon had become a trap. Bullets struck the rocks around them. Dust filled the air. Clara clutched the journal tightly against her chest. Jacob fired once. The shot forced one outlaw to duck behind a tree, but they remained badly outnumbered. Victor laughed. Hand over the journal. Jacob answered with silence. Victor's smile faded. Fine. He raised his rifle. Then we'll bury you with your father. Before he could fire, a distant gunshot echoed from behind the outlaws. Another, then another. 3 riders fell from their horses. Victor spun around. What the? More horsemen charged into the canyon. Sheriff Collins, along with nearly 20 ranchers from Red Creek. The sheriff raised his rifle. Drop your weapons. Chaos erupted. Outlaws scattered. Horses bolted in every direction. Several surrendered immediately. Others fled deeper into the mountains. Victor Kane escaped into the forest with 2 remaining riders. Within minutes, the canyon became silent once again. Sheriff Collins climbed down beside Jacob. You all right? Jacob nodded. Barely. The sheriff noticed the journal. So that's what everyone's been killing for. Jacob looked toward Eagle Rock towering above the valley. No. He held up the final letter. This is. The sheriff frowned. What does it say? Jacob slowly folded the paper. It tells us where my father hid the truth. Far above them, an enormous stone formation shaped like an eagle overlooked the canyon. Beneath it, according to Edward Turner, lay the evidence capable of exposing a conspiracy buried for 25 years. But Jacob knew something else. Victor Kane had escaped, and desperate men rarely surrendered forever. The final journey had only begun. The greatest secret of the American frontier waited beneath Eagle Rock, and someone would have to decide whether revealing the truth was worth risking everything. The first light of dawn spilled across the towering cliffs surrounding Eagle Rock, painting the rugged Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and amber. A cold mountain breeze swept through the pines as Jacob Turner stood at the base of the enormous rock formation, described in his father's journal. From below, the giant stone truly resembled an eagle with its wings spread wide over the valley, silently guarding whatever Edward Turner had hidden there 25 years earlier. Sheriff Collins studied the cliffs through his binoculars. If Victor Kane escaped, he said quietly, he won't be far. Jacob nodded. He knows this is the place. Clara carefully unfolded the old map. Once more. There. She pointed toward a narrow ledge hidden behind thick pine trees. The journal says there's a cave. The group tied their horses near the river and climbed the rocky trail on foot. Every step echoed through the canyon. Loose stones rolled beneath their boots, disappearing into the valley below. Halfway up the mountain, Jacob noticed something carved into the rock. It was the same symbol stamped onto his father's journal. Two crossed stars. Below them were four faded words. Truth outlives every lie. Jacob ran his fingers across the carving. My father was here. Clara smiled softly. He wanted you to find this. A few minutes later, they reached a narrow opening hidden behind hanging vines. At first glance it looked like an ordinary crack in the cliff, but inside was a surprisingly large cave. Jacob lit an old lantern. Its warm glow revealed wooden crates stacked against the walls. Dust covered everything. No one had entered the cave in decades. Sheriff Collins slowly opened the nearest crate. Inside, there was no gold, no money, only dozens of leather-bound books and sealed government documents. Jacob carefully opened one. His eyes widened. Every page contained land records, signed contracts, and handwritten confessions linking powerful businessmen and politicians to illegal land seizures across the frontier. Clara whispered, "My grandfather told me the truth was worth more than gold." Now Jacob understood why. These papers could destroy powerful families. They could restore stolen ranches to innocent people. They could expose crimes hidden for generations. Edward Turner hadn't stolen anything. He had protected the evidence until someone honest could reveal it. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the cave entrance. "I've been looking for those." Jacob turned instantly. Victor Kane stood at the entrance with nearly a dozen armed men. Their rifles were already aimed. Sheriff Collins reached for his revolver. Victor shook his head. "I wouldn't." The sheriff slowly stopped. Victor smiled. "I knew you'd find the cave for me." Jacob stepped forward. "You'll never leave here with those records." Victor laughed. "Oh, I don't need all of them." He pointed toward a small iron box resting on a stone shelf. "I only need what's inside that box." Jacob looked toward it. Unlike the other crates, the iron box carried a heavy brass lock. Edward Turner had protected it separately. Victor's eyes never left it. "Bring me the box." Jacob didn't move. Victor sighed. "I was hoping you'd make this easy." He raised his rifle. Then, an elderly voice echoed through the cave. "You've always been impatient, Victor." Everyone turned. An old man slowly stepped from the darkness behind the iron box. Long white beard, weathered face, worn cowboy hat. His clothes looked decades out of date. Jacob stared in disbelief. The lantern nearly slipped from his hand. The old man looked directly at him. For several seconds neither spoke. Finally, the stranger smiled. "Hello, son." Jacob felt the world stop spinning. His father's voice, older, weaker, but unmistakable. Edward Turner was alive. Complete silence filled the cave. Victor Kane looked just as shocked. "I thought you were dead." Edward calmly removed his hat. "You were supposed to." Jacob struggled to find words. "You ... His voice broke. "You left." Edward lowered his eyes. "I did. 25 years. I'm sorry." Jacob's anger mixed with disbelief. "My mother waited for you." Pain crossed Edward's face. "I know. She died believing you'd abandoned us." Edward closed his eyes. "I know." For a long moment, neither father nor son moved. 25 years of unanswered questions stood between them. Victor interrupted. "This family reunion is touching ... He aimed his rifle. "But I still need that box." Edward slowly stepped in front of it. "No." Victor smiled coldly. "You've protected it long enough." Edward looked toward Jacob. "Inside that box ... He paused. ... Is the list." Jacob frowned. "What list?" "The names of every person who planned the land thefts." Victor shouted. "Enough." He fired. Boom. The bullet struck a lantern. Darkness swallowed the cave. People shouted. Gunfire erupted. Flashes from rifle barrels lit the darkness like lightning. Jacob grabbed Clara and pulled her behind a stone wall. Sheriff Collins exchanged shots with the outlaws. Edward disappeared into the darkness carrying the iron box. Victor chased after him. The cave echoed with chaos. Then, a deafening crack shook the mountain. The ceiling trembled. Huge rocks began falling. "The cave is collapsing," someone shouted. Dust filled the air. Jacob searched desperately. "Father," no answer. Another section of the ceiling crashed down, blocking the tunnel. Victor barely escaped with 2 of his men. The others fled. Minutes later, silence returned. The cave entrance remained open, but the inner chamber had completely collapsed. Edward Turner and the iron box were trapped beneath thousands of pounds of rock. Jacob stood frozen. Sheriff Collins placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry." Jacob stared at the collapsed tunnel. "No." His voice became firm. He survived 25 years. He looked directly at the pile of stone. "I'm not leaving him now." Somewhere beneath Eagle Rock, Edward Turner was still alive. Or so Jacob desperately hoped. The greatest mystery of his life had finally become a race against time. Because if they couldn't reach Edward soon, the truth buried beneath Eagle Rock would disappear forever. The mountain had fallen silent. Only drifting dust and the distant cries of frightened horses broke the stillness around Eagle Rock. Jacob Turner stood before the collapsed tunnel, unable to take his eyes off the mountain of stone that now sealed the cave. Somewhere beneath thousands of pounds of rock was the man he had believed dead for 25 years. His father, Sheriff Collins, placed a lantern on a nearby boulder. "We have to move these rocks." Without another word, every rancher stepped forward. For hours they worked. Large stones were rolled aside with ropes. Smaller rocks were lifted by hand. The afternoon sun climbed high over the mountains, but nobody stopped. Not even Clara. Her hands bled from pulling sharp pieces of rock, yet she refused to rest. "If Edward stayed alive this long," she whispered, "he deserves every chance we can give him." Jacob nodded silently and continued digging. As sunset approached, one of the ranchers shouted, "I found something." Everyone rushed toward him. Hidden beneath loose rocks was a narrow opening barely large enough for one man. Cold air flowed from inside. Jacob grabbed a lantern. "I'm going in." Sheriff Collins caught his arm. "It's dangerous." Jacob looked into the darkness. So was leaving him. Without waiting for another word, he crawled through the opening. The tunnel was tight and filled with dust. Every movement caused loose gravel to fall from the ceiling. Nearly 20 feet inside, the passage widened into a hidden chamber untouched by the collapse. Jacob raised the lantern. There, leaning against the cave wall, sat Edward Turner, awake, covered in dust, but alive. The old cowboy smiled faintly. "I figured you'd come." Jacob dropped to his knees beside him. "You stubborn old man." Edward chuckled weakly. "You got that from me." For several moments neither spoke. 25 years of silence disappeared in a single embrace. Jacob helped his father stand. Edward winced in pain, but remained on his feet. "I'm all right." "No, you're not. I've been worse." Together they slowly walked deeper into the chamber. Then Jacob noticed something resting beside Edward. The iron box, still locked, still untouched. Edward gently picked it up. "I protected this for half my life." Jacob stared at it. "What's inside?" Edward looked directly into his son's eyes. The truth. They emerged from the cave just after sunset. The waiting ranchers erupted with relief. Clara ran forward. Tears filled her eyes as she embraced the old cowboy. "I thought we'd lost you." Edward smiled kindly. "Not yet." Sheriff Collins examined the heavy iron box. "This caused all of this?" Edward nodded. "It contains names ... He paused. ... of the men who stole thousands of acres from honest families." The sheriff frowned. "And Victor Kane? He works for the last surviving member of that group." Jacob looked surprised. "You mean Victor isn't the leader?" Edward slowly shook his head. "No." "Then who is?" Edward's expression became serious. "A man named Charles Whitmore." Silence followed. Sheriff Collins looked shocked. "The railroad owner?" Edward nodded. "The richest man in the territory." Jacob couldn't believe it. Whitmore had donated money to schools, churches, hospitals. Everyone believed he was a hero. Edward sighed. He built his fortune on stolen land. Before anyone could speak again, a rifle shot echoed through the valley. Boom! The bullet shattered the lantern. Darkness swallowed the camp. Victor Kane stepped from the trees. This time he wasn't smiling. Around him stood nearly 20 armed riders. "You should have stayed buried, old man." Edward slowly stepped forward. "I buried enough lies." Victor pointed his rifle directly at the iron box. "Give it to me." Edward refused. Victor counted slowly. 3. Nobody moved. 2. Jacob quietly pulled Clara behind a large boulder. 1. Gunfire exploded. The peaceful valley erupted into chaos. Bullets echoed across the cliffs. Ranchers fired from behind rocks. Sheriff Collins ordered everyone to spread out. Victor's riders charged downhill on horseback. Jacob mounted his horse and galloped across the valley, drawing several riders away from the others. The chase thundered through the mountains. Dust and loose snow flew beneath pounding hooves. One outlaw rode alongside Jacob. The cowboy turned in his saddle and fired. The rider dropped his rifle and surrendered. Another outlaw blocked the trail ahead. Jacob pulled hard on the reins. His horse leaped over a fallen pine tree. The outlaw crashed into the log and tumbled into the snow. Meanwhile, near the cave entrance, Victor reached Edward. The old cowboy still held the iron box tightly. Victor pointed his revolver. "It's over." Edward calmly smiled. "No." He tossed the box, not toward Victor, toward Clara. She caught it instinctively. Victor spun around. "Get her." 3 riders chased Clara as she ran toward the forest. Jacob saw them. Without hesitation, he raced after them. The chase became desperate. Branches whipped across their faces. Snow sprayed behind galloping horses. One outlaw nearly reached Clara. Jacob fired once. The outlaw's hat flew into the air. He immediately pulled back. Clara reached an old wooden bridge crossing a deep river gorge. Halfway across, the bridge groaned. Its ropes snapped. The wooden planks collapsed behind her. She barely reached the opposite side. The pursuing riders couldn't follow. Victor watched helplessly from across the gorge, his face twisted with rage. Clara held the iron box tightly against her chest. For the first time, the evidence was finally beyond Victor's reach. But Jacob knew something else. Victor wasn't finished. Neither was Charles Whitmore. Because powerful men rarely surrendered without one final fight. The greatest battle still lay ahead, and inside the iron box waited a secret capable of changing the entire frontier forever. The first light of dawn spread across the Wyoming frontier as Jacob Turner and the remaining ranchers gathered near the broken bridge. Clara still held the heavy iron box against her chest. The cold morning air carried the scent of pine and fresh earth after the night's battle, but no one felt at peace. They all knew Victor Kane had escaped once again, and somewhere beyond the mountains, the powerful Charles Whitmore was preparing his final move. Edward Turner slowly walked toward Clara. "You protected it," he said proudly. Clara nodded. "My grandfather told me this box must never fall into the wrong hands." Edward smiled warmly. He chose the right person. Jacob looked at the heavy brass lock. "It's time." Edward reached into his coat pocket and removed a small rusted key hanging from a leather string. "I've carried this for 25 years. He placed it in Jacob's hand. "The truth belongs to your generation now." Jacob took a deep breath and inserted the key into the lock. With a loud metallic click, the iron box opened. Inside were dozens of neatly tied government documents, official land deeds, signed contracts, personal journals, court records, and a leather-bound notebook marked Original Ledger. Sheriff Collins carefully opened the ledger. His face turned pale. Every page contained names: Charles Whitmore, Terrence Blackwood, Samuel Hargrove, judges, military officers, bank owners, sheriffs, politicians. Each signature proved they had worked together to steal thousands of acres from honest frontier families by using forged legal documents and intimidation. Families who refused to leave had their homes burned. Others disappeared without explanation. The conspiracy had lasted for decades. Sheriff Collins closed the book slowly. "This is enough to send every one of them to prison." Edward nodded. "That's why they hunted me." Jacob looked at his father. "You could have exposed them years ago." Edward lowered his head. "They threatened your mother." Silence fell over the group. "I stayed away because every time they found me ... they threatened to come after both of you." Jacob finally understood. His father had never abandoned the family. He had sacrificed his own life to protect them. Tears filled Jacob's eyes as he embraced Edward. "I'm sorry I believed the lies." Edward smiled. "You had every reason to." Just then, a distant cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Sheriff Collins raised his binoculars. "They're coming." Nearly 30 armed riders thundered across the valley. At their front rode Victor Kane. Beside him, a wealthy older man wearing a black riding coat and expensive hat. Charles Whitmore, the richest man in the territory. He stopped his horse only a few yards away. His expression remained calm. He looked directly at Edward. "You've finally decided to destroy everything I built." Edward answered quietly. You built it on stolen lives. Whitmore sighed. "I offered you money. You offered me silence." Whitmore smiled coldly. "And today I'll offer you a grave." Victor Kane raised his rifle. Before he could fire, a loud whistle echoed across the valley. Everyone turned. Hundreds of riders appeared over the nearby hills. Farmers, ranchers, families from towns across the frontier. Word had spread overnight. People whose land had been stolen had come together after hearing Sheriff Collins' call for help. Whitmore's confident smile disappeared. He suddenly realized he was outnumbered. Sheriff Collins stepped forward holding the ledger high. "I have signed evidence of every crime." Whitmore reached for his revolver. "You'll never leave this valley." Before he could draw, Jacob fired one warning shot into the air. The echo rolled across the mountains. Immediately dozens of rifles pointed toward Whitmore and his men. Victor slowly lowered his weapon. One by one, the remaining outlaws dropped theirs onto the ground. Whitmore looked around desperately. Even several of his own riders dismounted and surrendered. His empire had collapsed, not because of violence, because the truth could no longer be hidden. Sheriff Collins rode forward. "Charles Whitmore." He removed a pair of iron handcuffs. You're under arrest." Whitmore said nothing. For the first time in his life, he had no power left. Weeks later, the courthouse in Red Creek overflowed with people. The documents from the iron box were presented before the judge. Every signature was verified. Every stolen deed was exposed. Families who had lost their ranches decades earlier finally received justice. Charles Whitmore and Victor Kane were convicted for conspiracy, fraud, murder, and land theft. Their organization disappeared forever. Edward Turner was publicly declared innocent. The government officially cleared his name. Newspapers across the frontier called him the cowboy who protected the truth. Months later, life returned to the Turner Ranch. The fences were repaired. The cattle grazed peacefully. Children laughed across the fields. Edward and Jacob worked side by side repairing the same old barn where Jacob had once learned to swing a hammer as a boy. One afternoon, Clara arrived carrying fresh bread from town. She smiled as Jacob walked toward her. "I guess this ranch finally feels like home again." Jacob smiled back. "It does." Edward watched them from the porch with quiet happiness. For 25 years, he had dreamed of returning. Now, his family was finally together. As the sun slowly settled over the Wyoming mountains, 3 generations stood together on the front porch of the Turner Ranch, watching horses graze beneath a golden sky. Jacob looked toward his father. "What happens now?" Edward smiled. "Now we live honestly." The wind carried away the last traces of the past. The secrets were gone. The lies were buried. Only the truth remained. And sometimes, the greatest treasure a cowboy can leave behind isn't gold. It's his name. The end. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this emotional Western story, please like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more cinematic cowboy adventures, frontier mysteries, and unforgettable stories every week. Your support helps bring more powerful stories to life.